You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Jeremy Wells to discuss his book, Managing the Magic of Old Places, Crafting Public Policies for People-Centered Historic Preservation. We chat about the impact of old places on people's emotions and the current state of the preservation profession. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super amazing and kind Patreon supporters. We appreciate you all keeping this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire going. To join this merry band of subway crayonistas and city smarties, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note sent with a cool train station stamp. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scars. And if you want to just give a single dollar a month, you'll be able to get the podcast with zero outside ads or podcast recommendations in Patreon. We'll leave information in the show notes about how to do it and how to get it into your podcatcher. We've also recently put up some bonus material and have weekly free posts from our newsletter intro, so check it out if you haven't already. And speaking of scarves, it's still winter, so get your heavyweight bus or bike scarves. You definitely need one for you, your friends, your colleagues, and for the anti-bust activists you just want to frustrate. If you want to get one of the bus or bike scarves or the lightweight bike scarf for hot climates, visit theoverheadwire.com or support us on Patreon. There are many other ways to support the show, including buying books from the bookshop site, either the books from the authors we interview or any book you like. bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. And find our Cars Are Cholesterol merch at bit.ly/carsarecholesterol. And for anything else, including the Town Planning and Practice audiobook that plays like a podcast, visit theoverheadwire.com. You can also get that podcast from Libby at your public library. And finally, definitely sign up for the now 20-year-old daily newsletter at theoverheadwire.com, established in 2006, and our over 100,000 item link archive tagged by topic and city. We'll leave a YouTube explainer video in the show notes for that one as well. Or you can just keep listening and enjoying the show. We appreciate that too. You can find us mostly on Blue Sky and Mastodon, sometimes on Threads, Instagram, Flickr, YouTube, Substack, and LinkedIn if you want to connect, usually at the Overhead Wire, but with Flickr, it's called Transit Nerds. We've got some great stuff coming up in our 13th year of the podcast, so keep on listening for announcements, but for now, just enjoy the show. Jeremy Wells, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, so up until a few years ago, I was an associate professor at the University of Maryland, where I was teaching in their historic preservation program. So I've got, a couple decades of experience in the world of higher education and historic preservation. And before that, I was leading the historic preservation program for the city of Denver. I've worked in Main Street. I've done work in architectural materials conservation. So a lot of stuff that's happening pretty much in every segment of what you would think of as historic preservation. But more recently, I've had the luxury, really, of actually being able to spend a bit more time with my family and my music. So I do electronic music, combining that with folk, which is an absolute blast.
Nice. How'd you get into that?
So this preservation world is my second career. The first career was actually music. I was signed to a couple of record labels back in the 90s. One of them was in Germany. And so I did techno music and then ambient electronic. And, I had a pretty strong fan following base, but it's hard in the music world to make enough money to actually make it your career. And so that, segued into something that was more reasonable, perhaps. But it's been really cool to get back into that world. And in fact, my old project, which is called Violet Arcana, I just released a remastered version of our first album. And it's like, people are buying it again. It's like, whoa, people actually, awesome. It's like, didn't realize that. So yeah, it's fun.
So how does that segue then into historic preservation and your interest there? What got you interested in that topic?
Well, there's a strong connection with history because in my music, I'm really interested in especially European folk traditions and medieval music. And then I've got this real strong interest in electronic music. And so I combine it together. So, as much as I, would spend a lot of time a little bit further in my preservation past, like researching architectural history and public history, local history of sites. I've done the same thing with what's the history of the development of medieval music. And my personal interest is in the music of the Iberian Peninsula, Spanish and Portuguese, which has a really cool influence historically from the Middle East, from the Moors. So the thread is absolutely the interest in history.
That's awesome. I wonder if there's like connections to the built environment too. Obviously, musicians, they'll play to themselves, obviously, in the rural areas and stuff. But when they come to cities, they probably played a lot more and got a lot more interest. And maybe that's how people passed along things and stuff like that. So I'd be interested to read a book about that. That'd be fascinating.
I'm sure there's something out there. I mean, like just thinking in Portugal, there's all these traditions of the kinds of musical instruments people used based on if they were in the campesina, the countryside versus the city. So yeah, tradition is absolutely influenced by the built environment. Although I don't know if there's a direct connection between like the characteristics of the built environment and how the instruments develop. But that's a really cool topic, actually. You're making me think that would be interesting to look at.
I'm sure there's something out there.
Yeah.
Let me know when you find it.
Absolutely.
So your book is Managing the Magic of Old Places, Crafting Public Policies for People-Centered Historic Preservation. As an intro, can you tell us what historic preservation is or means and what counts as quote-unquote historic?
Really good question, because the first thing I would ask, are you coming from the perspective of the public or the perspective of the people that work in the field? Those are two different things.
From us, the public, the listeners of the show.
Yeah. So historic preservation is really first and foremost a social movement. So before all of this professionalization of the field started in the US and really abroad, it's very similar. There's a public movement, people who are interested in saving older places for lots of different reasons. And that interest, that movement, political movement really, is what spurred the development of public preservation policy in the US. And what I've done a lot of work studying is the differences between public perception and the perception of the experts that actually do preservation practice. Because the reasons why people, both historically and to the present, want to save older buildings and places, and especially what they think is important in terms of authenticity, protecting the authenticity of these places, can be very different than preservation doctrine and policy, which are the guidelines that's used by most preservation practice. So something as simple as people's emotional connection to places, like the research that I've done, which is very strongly focused on this area, is one of the most common reasons that the public, a member of the public, would like values or thinks an older place is important can often be reduced down to an emotional attachment to that place attachment. So I'm using environmental psychology. And it's a very subjective experience, obviously. Can be a very individualistic experience. And the really fascinating thing is this disconnect that I found between the perspective of a member of the public on that and the people who practice in preservation because of the doctrine and policy, which not only don't recognize emotional attachments to places, but they actually work against it to make historic preservation into kind of I'm not the only one that's used this phrase, but sort of a pseudoscientific enterprise that tries to make things as objective as possible about the built environment to make it easier to administer, especially in a regulatory environment. So that's an example of this really strong difference between why the public might think preservation is important and the drive that professionals working in preservation think it's important. And I'll add something else in here too that's fascinating. And as far as I know, I've been the only one that's done this work. But if you actually look at the psychological profile of people, just you take a random sample of, a group of people that represent the public, and you look at practicing professionals in the historic preservation field, they have different perceptions about the older built environment. So people who work in preservation are more likely to think older places are newer than the public. They're more likely to perceive patina and decay in different ways. And so these factors, it looks like there's the potential that there's actually a difference in how practicing professionals in the preservation world experience the older built environment compared to an average member of the public. And that starts to explain some of these differences. But it's such a beginning look at this potential difference that I'm a little careful to overly generalize from what that means. But all I can say right now is from my own research, there's absolutely psychological differences in perception and valuation based on whether or not you practice in preservation or you're just a general member of the public.
Do you think that's from self-selection? Is that from the folks who are the most interested in this or the people that want to systematize it the most? Why would somebody go into historic preservation and then have that difference of opinion or difference of feeling towards the built environment?
Yeah. So, there would be supposition certainly on my part, but I think you're getting to questions that I had as far as self-selection, because, it seems certainly probable that someone who's interested in the older built environment would actually want to spend their career working on it, would experience the built environment in a different way that would perhaps be more meaningful to them. But, again, what that is and why that is, it's hard to narrow it down beyond that point.
What does it mean to you?
To me, so that one actually, and this is maybe what makes me a little different than people practicing in the preservation world, is that from an incredibly early age, I'm thinking like when I was 8 years old and for the first time visiting ghost towns in Idaho, that for me was the feeling that I felt in these places, the mystery, the sense of like, what in the world happened here? Why has it been abandoned? Or even like you're thinking into the future, what's going to happen to this place? And so that kind of set in motion for me this interest in people's emotional attachment to place, because that's where I started. For other people, like if you talk in the preservation world, there's often a very strong aesthetic attachment to the older built environment, beauty. This is actually, I've not published research on this, but I've started doing some content analysis of historic preservation videos on YouTube. And one of the most common phrases that people in the preservation world use is that places are treasures or they're gems. It's an elevation of like sort of this rarefied artistic value that seems to potentially attract certainly a fair number of people to the preservation field because that's the words that they're actually using. So that seems to be maybe most people, I would say, just from my personal experience. I can't point to any sort of generalizable study on that, but for many other people, the reason they're interested, even in a professional sense, in the older built environment is because they have connections through their community to this place. So I'm thinking of people who have in the past, say, 10, 15 years, been interested in preservation as a vehicle to preserve African American history. And so people from marginalized groups getting involved in preservation practice. And they often do it, interestingly enough, not from the preservation world, but they're often planners or people from other disciplines that are coming in and then doing preservation, because often they find that there's much more flexibility than coming in through the preservation world, that especially marginalized communities in the places that are important to them can be very difficult to sometimes get recognized by the official preservation system in terms of like listing on a local or a national register. And so working outside that system can often be much more useful and productive. I mean, there's a huge number of reasons why people are interested in preservation.
That's another question I have is, and you mentioned this in the book to a certain extent, is like, what kind of work is in preservation? Like what kind of work exists in preservation? If you want to get a job in preservation, like what do you end up doing?
So this I can answer actually empirically, because this is the research I've absolutely done to answer a really basic question that no one has answered until the point that I collected the data and analyzed it, is your question. What do people actually do for paid work in the preservation world? And how is that distributed? And so the answer to that, if you look at full-time paid positions in the historic preservation field, about 70% of the people who work in historic preservation are involved in regulatory compliance. So the primary reason their job exists is to satisfy a statutory obligation at the federal, the state, or the local level. So of that 70%, about 40% is at the local level. And so these are people who work as, they're often called preservation planners, but they're staff that support what are called local historic preservation commissions. And interestingly enough, they're more often than not in planning departments, but they tend to be, they work very separately. Because while, especially, long range planners are not as involved, say, like with zoning permitting, even planners working in zoning permitting often work in much larger areas, especially in cities. Preservationists working in local government will more often than not be working with the frontline permit staff and development services. And so the worlds are different, even though preservation at the local level is often put with planning. It's actually a much better and logical fit with development services in terms of city government. And then at the federal level, you get people working in environmental compliance. So the National Historic Preservation Act refers to this as Section 106. We call this Section 106 compliance. And so anytime the federal government does what's called an undertaking, they want to demolish something. I mean, this came up with the White House. But actually,
we'll get to that in a bit too.
Yeah. There's an exemption there that gets complicated. But even like federal property, the GSA is trying to get rid of federal property. That's actually called a federal undertaking. It has to go through a process where professionals working in historic preservation have to identify is it historically significant or eligible to the National Register, and then engage in what's called a consultation process that is supposed to, and I'll put this in quotes, supposed to involve the public so that there can be a discussion on possible ways to mitigate what that undertaking is. And so states have this at the state level, but for the most part, it parallels federal environmental review. So that's 70% of the practice in historic preservation. A lot of this overlaps with what's called cultural resource management, so with archaeology, but like this is above ground stuff. And then you've got like about 10% of people that work in construction and architecture. So preservation architects, so contractors that are doing preservation work. And then it splits up a little bit smaller than that. People who work in preservation advocacy, like the National Trust for Historic Preservation. All the states pretty much have a statewide preservation advocacy organization. There are some at the local level. And then you have a much smaller subset of people who are working specifically in downtown revitalization. So this is like called Main Street programs. And then the last little small part is historic site management and interpretation. So, you go to a state historic site, and the people who run that are paid professionals in the preservation field, managing and helping to preserve an historic site.
So why would people be surprised about that, though? Because in the book you mentioned that like people are surprised that the compliance is such a large part of it, and maybe they think it should be something else.
So actually, if you go to studies, and there's been some studies on this about what the public thinks of historic preservation, the paid professionals that do that, what comes up most often is architecture and construction. And often in the context of, I'll call it this old house. So, saving old houses and rehabilitating them, renovating them. That's a very strong public perception. And the other strong public perception that's at a secondary level is, like what I mentioned, historic sites, museums. That's a big thing. And most members of the public, based on these surveys, don't think very much about the regulatory environment in terms of like how many people actually work in that area, even though that is the big area in historic preservation. So there's a big disconnect in terms of what the public actually thinks of historic preservation work and the work that actually gets done in it. And then the people who work in preservation, I would say conversely, they don't really want to be identified with being driven by the regulatory environment and it's fascinating when you read people in the preservation world talk about how they're perceived by the public. The phrases that come out are that preservation professionals don't want to be known as the no people or the preservation police. And so there's a big pushback within the field to, in essence, deny how fundamentally centered in public policy the work of preservation is, because they don't like it. It's the public perception issue. But the fact that, the professional preservation field has been around in some way or form in the U.S. for half a century. And it took me until I did the study in 2000, I published it in 2017. It took my work to come along and actually answer this basic question of where do people work in historic preservation and what do they do? Which, as a former preservation education professional working in universities, like how can people actually engage in educating students when they don't even know where they're going to be working? There's so many weird things that come out of, maybe because it's such a small field, that things that people really don't know and have long assumed. And it takes more people to come along and actually do this research to understand what is this thing, especially in a professional sense that we call preservation, but also even that basic question of like, how does the public perceive preservation? All of this is so ripe for understanding and research to help drive that. And there's just not enough of it being done.
Yeah. I also have another question about the people orientation direction that you took. And I want to say this delicately because it's not an insult to you necessarily, but your preface in the book is kind of strange to me because in the field of transportation, where my colleagues are trying desperately to orient infrastructure towards people, I'm both shocked and not surprised at the reactions you've received for your work. Policy and law are weighted heavily towards auto dependence, and the mirror between my field and yours is quite striking. So when I read your preface and you're like, the profession doesn't want to be people oriented. We're, focused on other things. And I was like, well, that tracks, I guess, with a lot of the stuff that we're working on too. And so I feel like there's a mirror there. And I'm shocked that it was such a, that your findings and your work is such a, a lightning rod to a certain extent.
Controversial. I'll give you a good idea of why this is the case. I recently did a presentation at a statewide preservation conference a couple of weeks ago. And the person that was introducing me it was a keynote that I was giving, introduced me as a very controversial figure in the field, specifically because I was focusing on being people-centered. And so that was the focus of the presentation, was essentially when I'm focusing on the book about the ways that historic preservation traditionally is often focused on things and objects. And it's important to look at preservation in terms of how it can help people. So it is really fascinating, that basic message that the work that we do in historic preservation should benefit people, because the very traditional and orthodox perspective is that people should be benefiting preservation. In other words, people, in a very basal way, people exist to save buildings and preserve buildings. And I'm flipping that around and saying buildings are here to help people. And I'm not unique in this, but it is a minority perspective in historic preservation. I think one of the sad things, maybe that's the best way I can put it, in the preservation field is that when the National Trust, this was back in 2019-ish, did some work on what it called people-centered preservation. And I was involved very intimately with a lot of the people in the historic preservation movement, especially in the National Trust, to help work on this idea of what is people-centered preservation. And they released kind of I call it a manifesto of what it means. And it was, I thought, an incredible movement forward in terms of a more people-centered field. But what ended up happening is that this idea of people-centered preservation, I would say mostly in the US, because abroad this is different, ended up being sort of condensed into diversity and inclusion. And I have to be careful here because by making that statement, I'm by no means at all implying that diversity and inclusion in preservation isn't important. It is. This is a very white field. Of all the built environment disciplines, you cannot find a wider field. But the problem I see is that people-centeredness is about people of many identities. And absolutely, diversity and inclusion is a big part of it. But so are these issues I'm talking about in terms of general disconnect between the public and practicing professionals in preservation. And so the problem is that the field just sort of stopped there, and then it sort of went backwards in a sense. And so when you look at the orthodoxy of what's in preservation, not a lot's changed based on what the National Trust was coming up with. And again, I think the model that they were talking about was such an incredible way to move forward, and then it sort of disappeared. It's rather sad.
What does it look like? What does the model look like?
Things like recognizing that significance about places. If you're going to establish that, you need to actually go out and talk to the people who live in these places or associated with these places. And that needs to be balanced with traditional expertise of historians and architectural historians to figure out why places are historically significant. It needs to look at things like historical integrity, like authenticity from the perspective of the public, but also just a lot of language that goes into why old places benefit people, and try and reorient professional practice around how its practice can benefit people rather than what is an orthodoxy is how can a historic preservation practice essentially, and I kind of reduce this to its basal form, the way that preservation practice works today is how can preservation practice benefit the less than 100 people who created or helped to develop public policy and preservation in the US. It's a very strange perspective that the way that preservation is practiced largely in the US is essentially to make a very small number of dead white men happy. And it doesn't have anything to do with the public. And that's people-centered preservation. Really, it just says, it's a more of a grassroots approach. It's looking at many members of the public, many identities in terms of why are places historically significant and what is the benefits of these places and what should we do with them, and letting that inform and balance this traditional perspective on preservation.
And your focus also is thinking more about environmental psychology, and I'm wondering why that was missing, because I feel like we went through this as well in the planning field, in the urban design field. Famous Danish planner Jan Gehl published his popular book, Life Between Buildings, in 1971, and he was influenced heavily by his wife, a psychologist, to look at the built environment a little bit differently. And so, I mean, not everybody's read Jan Gehl, and I understand that, and not everybody who's a planner is like on board with that specifically, but I feel like we've made a step in that direction, and I'm just wondering why the field of preservation is kind of far behind when it comes to the discussion that planners and transportation planners are having.
Well, I even back that up because I used to be the chair of the Environmental Design Research Association. And so this question of why isn't environmental psychology more central to the work of the built environment disciplines, planning and architecture, interior design, and landscape architecture and historic preservation, they all, I think, have struggled with trying to legitimize that perspective. And I think planning has done a better job than architecture, for instance. Architecture struggles with this idea of does, the genius of an architect's design aptitude, is that more important, or is it looking at empirical evidence and how people who use a building should influence how the building is built? And that just describes the tension in architecture to a T in many cases. But in preservation, more centrally, to take an environmental psychology perspective, you have to center people, or at least a person to some extent, and start not necessarily sidelining, but sort of saying, traditional orthodoxy and preservation doctrine, we need to kind of push that to the side a little bit and try and learn from people. How does a person perceive authenticity and the authenticity of historic places? What is that process actually like? What does the emotional attachment look like to older places, and how is that different than to something that's more contemporary? And so it's developing data that then can be analyzed that could, well, theoretically, potentially even inform preservation policy as well as doctrine. I mean, you know this in planning, right? We used to be in a rational mode of planning with Moses, right? You know, the idea of the genius of a planner came from the top down, plan something and then implement it on the ground. And that got replaced, with the more communicative form of planning where, okay, we need to actually have discussions with members of the public and the people who are affected. We have stakeholders. So we're collecting data and information that then informs the opinions of experts. And that's where planning has been for a long time. We're not quite there with preservation because in preservation, we're at a state where the experts are still making the decisions, ultimately, why places are significant, what to do with them. And then we go to the public to, in essence, have us confirm what we've already decided is true. That's what public participation is in most preservation. So the challenge is to look at things because preservation is so policy driven. Things like the Secretary of the Interior standards and National Register criteria, these are actually in laws and regulations. And it's hard to get people to step away from that and replace that doctrine with something from environmental psychology, which is looking at, again, that psychological perspective about why people value older places. And I mean, a lot of people in the policy world would say they don't have time for that because, they've got a stack of permits they have to approve, or, they have to do something in Section 106 for reviewing comments. And this can be tangential. And this gets to, I mean, I can go really deep in this because there's sort of an intellectual side of this as well in the policy world where people working in government have brought up these issues, these people-centered issues in government, and have found less than receptive ears to this. And so, I mean, the one thing I can direct your audience to is there's a gentleman by the name of Jack Elliott. And he used to work in the State Preservation Office of Mississippi. And he's published on this. So these are peer-reviewed publications he's put out. In there, what he describes is that he tried to convince the State Preservation Office to look at its work in terms of public benefit and a people-centered orientation, especially in terms of like looking at historical significance. And his boss essentially told him, I mean, this is direct quotes from Jack Elliott, that he's not paid to think. He's just paid to implement the statutes that the state has and what the work is that they do. And you might think that's isolated, but I've not found that. Another example of this is I used to do a lot of work with setting up conferences on these topics of people-centered preservation. And I spent a lot of time trying to get practicing professionals there, especially local historic preservation professionals working in local government. I would find funding to get them out there, and that worked out really well. And we had wonderful discussions. The perspective of a professional on the ground is just so important when you're talking about these kind of theoretical things. But every single one of those local preservation planners, when they came to the conferences I set up, when I met them, they would have, the tag from the conference, and they'd have the name on there, and it was folded underneath. And I went, what's going on? And what they were doing is they were folding it under so that no one would know what city they were from. And I had a group of them. I said, why are you folding your name tag over? And they said, well, we can't be seen as talking against what is in our preservation ordinance for our city. So the only way we feel that we can freely share what we think are the issues with how our cities are doing preservation, we have to protect ourselves. That is a very strong thread in preservation and government, that people are very afraid to talk about the lack of this people-centered orientation in the field. And either they seek out anonymity or they try and distance themselves from the government organization that they work with. Or in the case of Jack Elliott, they retire so they can actually speak freely about their experience. But to me, that's just one reason why historic preservation public policy in the U.S. has really been frozen for a half century. There's a lot of people, we know what needs to change, but we're terrified to speak up. Either we're afraid we're going to lose our job, or and a lot of people think, well, if we speak up, we'll lose the gains that we've had, that if we speak up and these regulations change, then we won't have these regulations in place to save buildings. And so no one talks.
Who's coming after people besides losing a job? I mean, but who is the person that would make someone lose a job? I guess I don't understand like the threat from who and from where. Is it people who are, freaked out about their buildings changing, or is it, something's going to happen that makes, elected officials lose an election? Like, what's the threat?
Well, so there's always an implied threat of some sort of professional punishment or losing your job. I mean, Jack Elliott talks to that. I cannot speak from an empirical basis. Like if people have lost jobs specifically over this and what percentage, I don't know. All I'm expressing is the fear which is palpable about just simply talking about these issues in the context of local, state, and federal government. I can share with you my own personal experience on this, and that is when I was leading the historic preservation program for the city of Denver. I was talking to my manager at the time, the planning director of the program, and I brought up these ideas around people-centered preservation. And this is rather frustrating to me because I was hired specifically to bring a more contemporary perspective to the preservation program in the city. And I had a doctorate degree at that point. It's like, if you're going to hire someone with a doctoral degree, they're going to probably have ideas, right? But I had a discussion about, are there ways that the city, we could start thinking about having a more people-centered focus in terms of what we do in the preservation program. And I mentioned we're doing some really good things around changing zoning in the city with all this public participation. I said, it'd be great to see something happen like that with preservation. And the planning director said, he said, you know what? And it's like this paid thing. He said, literally, you're paid to do permit review and to approve certificate of appropriateness applications for our local historic districts. That's what you're supposed to do. And the people that you work with, that's what they're supposed to do. We don't have time for this. And then he made a comment that this is too academic. And it's just like an immediate shutting down of the conversation. But it really does represent, not only in my experience, but many people working in government, how much the perception of the role that people play in local, state, and federal government preservation is kind of checking the box, permit review, and things like public engagement that goes beyond statutory obligations, or even sometimes it even meets those, is too time consuming. Just the permits need to be done. And to give the people who work in local government with preservation, there's a real need to focus on this because they're often overloaded. They don't have enough staff to do this. And so it's like two factors. One is that a lot of people working in government, public policy, and preservation don't have time to address these issues because they're just trying to get the exigent day-to-day stuff done. And there's not necessarily a lot of support and management for really talking or addressing many of these ideas. So it's a frustrating experience, especially for people who work in local government, state government, federal government with preservation. I mean, I was just speaking to Stephanie Toothman, and she's spoken publicly on this about how, when she worked in the National Park Service, how her work was continually stifled. She was continually blocked around things like she was trying to do work around revising National Register criteria and just constantly blocked. There's a lot of difficulties here. And I long ago stepped away from any hubris that I would have any sort of influence over changing this. I mean, all I can do is speak to it. But awareness has to start someplace. It has to absolutely start someplace.
I want to speak a little bit about something like a little bit more happy.
Sure. That sounds great.
Not that I don't like hearing about this. It's just strange from my perspective and from the folks that I talk to all the time. I'm just like, wow, that seems weird that you wouldn't want to encourage thoughtfulness or to encourage, advancement in the field. But maybe that's me who worked for a think tank for quite a while.
I mean, it also might be the planning field because urban and regional planning, whether it's more people-centered focus or just maybe even going back to the tradition of how people are educated, going through planning programs, there tends to be a much more open-ended idea about what is planning doctrine, shall we say. The textbooks that students read in planning programs tend to be much more diverse. They include the social sciences, for instance, whereas in preservation education programs, I mean, there's zero textbooks from the social sciences. There are often zero textbooks from urban and regional planning. It's either textbooks or programs that even just directly teach from things like the National Park Service's preservation briefs. And again, this just might be more of a symptom of just it's a very small field. And planning has accrediting bodies in education. We don't have that in historic preservation. We've got like the National Council for Preservation Education, but it's just an advisory body. Any program could call itself an historic preservation program because there's no accreditation agency for it. But it also means there's no one looking at the curriculum of what preservation programs are teaching. And so a lot of things, well, in my opinion, a lot of things that should be getting taught that would be a much broader exposure to the older built environment and people are just not part of the curriculum in most preservation programs. I say there's some big exceptions here. It's like some of the Ivies are doing a really good job. Let's say Columbia University's program. I know Erica Avrami. She's one of the absolute leaders in this space of looking at preservation policy and the issues around it. Really good program that other preservation programs should be emulating, but most don't.
I do want to ask you about the magic of places and how people perceive places, because I think that's an important part of it, the charm of places. Why do you think that's such an important element? I mean, I feel it myself. Like I went My mom's family, half of them are Italian. And so we went back to the small village where they came from, and you can see that it's been there since they left. And, there's some magic there. There's some charm in like the historicness of going back to a place where our predecessors or ancestors were from.
Mm-hmm.
And so that type of feeling, and I kind of, I glommed onto that in your discussion, because I feel like there is a magic and there is something about buildings that are older that you can tell that they're older, and then you can kind of feel their whatever it is.
Yeah. So the way that I started finding out about this is I just started listening to different groups, community groups, how they talked about older buildings and places. So it started with, I would call it sort of an anthropological, cultural perspective, and just simply listening to and doing participant observation. How do people talk about heritage and heritage places? What is it that they're saying that's important? And then there's absolutely published research out there that you can find. There's some in the US, most of it's international. That's the other thing, is a lot of people-centered research and preservation or heritage conservation tends to be from Europe, especially in Australia. Harder to find here in the US. So what researchers, and myself included, have been noticing is that most people tend to talk about older places in terms of this emotionally charged language with using words like magic and charm. I mean, that's an incredibly common repeated phrase, but also just the emotions, the feelings that older places instill in people. And then you go beyond that in like the research that I've done, where people describe what that experience is when they're in context with an historic building, like in it or looking at it, walking by it. And it's like all of these words come out that describe, mystery, sense of mystery. Older buildings are kind of like a puzzle that my mind wants to pull apart and figure out how did it change over time? What happened there? So the best way I can sort of summarize it is that part of this emotional attachment is just sort of the fascination of the older building and that sense of mystery, and looking at it as sort of, in a sense, an enigma in the older built environment. I mean, I think the closest parallel I can think to planning is like when you think about the 19th century and the idea of awe or the sublime. I mean, this goes way back, right? This idea that somehow a sense of mystery, or in that case, a sense of danger in the natural environment. Sometimes, there were the ruins that were part of this, instilled a sense, that feeling. Of course, artists were trying to go after that with paintings. I mean, they were onto something there. I mean, it was sort of a public perception in a sense that was being expressed in art. But if you go into the 20th century and into this century, in environmental psychology and anthropology as well, the sense of mystery and the discovery and the layered qualities of older places, that's another big part of it, is that when you understand the psychological perspective of someone experiencing an older built environment, it's like a series of layers that get unfolded and peeled back. And that what ruins it would be is if the person could experience it all at once. And that layered quality, it can be the vegetation, the fences, the way that older built environments naturally change over time and get more chaotic and complicated, adds to the sense of mystery and the sense of discovery that really creates that emotional quality that bonds people to place. But the thing that I found out that is really, really interesting, and a few other people have pointed this out in their research as well, I call it a spontaneous fantasy, is that mental experience of an older building or place. It catalyzes in people's mind's eye vignettes of the past. And it's not necessarily objectively historic vignettes of the past. Like they've read a book, the history of something, and then they go to this building and it's like they're reliving the history in their mind. It's precognitive, it's spontaneous, and it just simply pops into people's heads. And it's an emotional experience, like walking by an old building and, having a memory, an artificial memory, a sense of what happened there. And then that emotional attachment that comes to that. And then when people keep coming back to that place, they get that same vignette from the past and that same emotional attachment. And that builds up onto itself. And when you talk to people who've lived in older places for like decades, this is deep. This emotional attachment to places can be really deep. And it is this experience is such an important part to anybody in the historic preservation field. I would say planning in general or architecture, to understand how are people emotionally attached to places, because that can actually empirically inform even things like design and interventions in the older built environment. And that's where a lot of my work has been going in terms of, we have these tools, these social science tools, especially from environmental psychology, that can help us understand how people become attached to built environments just in general. And what a strong empirically driven tool for design that benefits the public. So I just see so much potential in this. And it's not just preservation. It's not just preservation. So I'm speaking from the Edger perspective on that.
I mean, I think it's really fascinating from the idea of just like, we have a housing shortage right now. And so we were trying to build more housing. And so there's a lot of discussion about
Sure.
what that housing would look like and where it should go. The connection of people to housing or to place is really important in that having that discussion with people. If there's a building going up across the street, they have this visceral reaction, many people do, to that. And so discussing that might be important in trying to solve some of the problems we have in urban planning at the moment, which is places aren't necessarily allowed to change and they're kind of stuck in their eras. You're in San Francisco. I'm in San Francisco right now.
Yeah.
The discussion about, whether a building should go up is hard. And sometimes the discussion about historic preservation itself makes it hard in that some people will try to save a building or a thing or a place that they have a connection to that other people are like, well, I don't get it. Why is that laundromat important?
Right.
Yes, it was the place that somebody organized at some point in the past, but it also could be a place where 50 families live. Right. And so, is the past important or is the future important? Is the present important? Is it the design of the place? Right. Like, I find that really fascinating, those connections. Also, I mean, it kind of brings me to this discussion about, like, you mentioned the conservation that's different in a place like Japan or China, which is you mentioned more circular, cyclical. I find that fascinating as well.
Yeah. Because I mean, there's lots of parts of the world that don't subscribe to this, very European driven idea of history and progress as this linear thing. That you're like on a train always heading to the future, because talking about Japan and other Asian cultures, other cultures around the world, as you mentioned, have a more cyclical version of what time is. And so it's always this idea that we're coming back to where we came from. So that cycle changes this basic fundamental tenet in what I call Western preservation philosophy. A fundamental part of what makes an older place important, historically significant, is its age. And also, in a sense, it reinforces documentary value, because one of the big reasons in a very expert-driven sense of why we do preservation is we're preserving a document or an older place as a literal kind of a book. It's evidence of itself. It's evidence how it was created and constructed and how people use that place. But that's also predicated on the idea, again, in this linear progress of history, that that's something we can never return to. And it really does elevate the value of historic preservation in that sense, because things that are in the past we'll never get back around to them in a sense from the future. But not all cultures think in those terms. I mean, there's a researcher who was looking at how African American communities look at the significance of older places. And she really focused on this issue of time. And she was saying, it's easy to think of American culture as something that's absolutely like homogenous, that we're all the same. We have the same ideas about history. But what Kenyatta was saying is that different cultures have different ideas, even in the U.S. about time. And for African American people, this idea of time always brings with it progress is not necessarily true. And so it just changes the idea of why things can be historically significant. And then when you get to Japan and other places in Asia, there's much more of an interest traditionally in why older places get saved is not like this more Western idea. We save it because of fabric, that we keep the building materials intact because, say, for instance, we want evidence of how things were made and constructed in the past. There's also a whole perspective, something called numismatism. There's much more of an interest in, does this historical object convey an intended meaning from the past? So it's like intangible. We call this intangible heritage in historic preservation. And so like in Japan, you'll have what, I'll put this in quotes, 1,000-year-old wood temples where most of the wood might be 100 years old or 150 years old. But the way the temple is continually reconstructed and designed has very carefully been curated in the sense that it's sending the same sort of semiotic cultural message that it did 1,000 years ago. And that's what's really important. So the reason why it's important to look at different cultures is that maybe we need to kind of step back from what we think is the right way to preserve from a professional historic preservation stance to say, there's actually lots of different ways, and maybe we should start thinking about these and considering them. I mean, the danger here is to think, because that's the mode we're in right now, is to think there's only one way to do preservation right. And by codifying everything in rules and regulations, it makes it really simple to just do it. But then you don't have to think about it or defend it. You just point to the regulation. It's just like, I'm just doing what it tells me. It short circuits conversations. But we just need to be having many more conversations, all people, whether the professionals or lay people, about older places and significance and where public policy should fall into it. And also I would say things like maybe the private sector shouldn't be adopting public preservation policy because, I mean, this is another interesting thing is that many private foundations that say hold preservation easements or they provide funding for work like in older buildings and places in their interpretation will include federal regulatory standards, like it has to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places, or all the work that happens to the building has to follow the Secretary of the Interior standards. Now, there's no requirement whatsoever that a private foundation has to follow federal law in this, but they often do. And so that's part of short-circuiting the discussion, that the people who actually do in organizations that have some autonomy in the space often don't take advantage of it for the public benefit. And again, I want to be careful. I don't think any of this is willful by any means. It just sort of like gets skipped over. We don't think about it. We don't talk about it. And I'll go back to preservation education. I don't think we're graduating historic preservation professionals who are equipped with a sort of reflexive, inward understanding of what the field is and their role in it. Because these questions don't get asked enough, and they should be.
Is part of the problem that I think this is connected, but let me know if I'm on the wrong track. It makes me think about the frozenness of planning and cities in the United States. And I just mentioned a little bit about that. It's hard to make change. This discussion you had in the book, it got me thinking about the differences and thinking about heritage specifically in that linear versus the cyclical model. But I feel like it also bleeds into this discourse about planning and change. And we recently had Ben Snyder on the show, and he noted in his recent book that before Euclid versus Ambler, which is the basis of zoning, most zoning in the United States, people expected change. Yoni Applebaum in his book Stuck, who recently, a writer at The Atlantic, and he came on the show and he was telling us about how in the 1900s and the late 1800s, people expected to move. They got better deals on housing. And so once a year, there was a big moving day and you could just see everybody moving, not just like a few people. Yeah. And so people expected change. They moved around a bunch. And now it feels like we're stuck in amber and we have this kind of sclerotic urban growth. There's a discussion recently about how some researchers had looked at the planning regimes in California and Texas and found that Texas isn't that different than California. They may have like a more open regime versus California is more specific, but they're very similar, and Texas is just 20 or 30 years behind California. And the reason why is because the neighborhoods are ossifying. They're becoming unchangeable because of the way people feel about them. And so I'm wondering, and all of this increases people's cost of living, it decreases their quality of life, but it also kind of reminds me of that discussion in historic preservation about what are we preserving and why? And are we stuck? Are we stuck in these rules and regulations from Euclid on that make us stuck versus more mobile, more vibrant, more able to change with the times?
Yeah. I mean, wow, these are such important questions that you're asking. I mean, it makes me think of, I don't know if you're familiar with Sarah Bronin. She did the
she's been on the show too.
Yeah, the Zoning Atlas.
Yep.
And this is not unique across the U.S. And so it would be absolutely patently false to say that this is something unique to preservation, that the regulatory environment is stopping change.
I'm bringing in everything. I wasn't saying it's just the preservation. I'm just saying like everything's connected in this large kind of slow moving blob.
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing to do is recognize this is all a political process to change. I mean, the old fashioned way of doing this is that the stakeholders with the most power basically push through what they wanted. We're in this more supposedly egalitarian participatory democracy phase of planning, but it makes it really complicated to try and understand, when you have conflicting values, whose values should surface, right? Like how in the world do you develop a regulatory environment around conflict? And the old fashioned way of doing this is, well, we pretend the conflict doesn't exist. And then the people who have the authority just do it the way they want to, conflict resolved. So I guess my response to this is that we don't really have, well, I don't know. I guess I have to be careful in saying this because it implies the people who are doing public participation work aren't doing good work. They absolutely are. But I would also say that we need better tools for public participation, but also in data management and analyzing what comes of those processes and then getting some sort of guidance from whatever that process is. I mean, it's like, it almost sounds like, this is a room for AI. I don't think that's an easy solution, right? By any means, but these are things that could get better, but it has to get better if we look at planning just in general in terms of how can we get better data and use that to guide processes and really understand what that is. And I think the low hanging fruit here is to use you've got millions of people posting all over social media and the internet about what they think about the built environment. And are we using that as any kind of data? I mean, I did an exploration of what we call the social heritage machine, but it could be applied to planning in general. But these are some computer scientists out of Brazil that I partnered with to research, could we create some sort of a tool that would essentially textually mine the internet and then analyze it, use sentiment analysis to try and identify, are there places and buildings that people are talking about that might have some sense of historical significance in the perspective of the public that's getting missed by standard planning processes? Are there things that people are talking about that we should be focusing more on? I mean, that's not a heritage specific thing. I mean, that's just generally planning. There's a lot of data out there that it's available in different ways other than, inviting people to a meeting and gathering data from them, through some sort of public participation process. And I'd say a lot of times those processes are not very participatory, but even when they really are, they bring the same crowd out, right? We know that that's going to attract people that are higher income, higher education, and they have a narrower slice of the socioeconomic reality than people who aren't going to come, who are working multiple jobs and they have children. They can get time off from work. But yet those people are still absolutely sharing things on the internet that we're not taking advantage of as planners to inform what our processes are. So, yeah, I mean, there's so many different ways to look at this.
I know.
Yeah.
I feel like we could chat about this for hours and hours and hours.
Yeah.
You talk about sharing online and people being interested in this stuff. I'm also a little bit worried about people kind of using historic preservation or heritage or specific design, classical design, as, a dog whistle to a certain extent. I guess that's the best way I could say it for white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of accounts out there that are connected to this stuff that have a lot of followers, and they bring people in that way of like, hey, look at these beautiful places. Look at these classic Doric columns or whatever it might be. Right. And then, at some point the switch flips and they become, fascist or white supremacist coded. And so I'm curious about that too. Like, what do you see in terms of the connection between the way that the political discourse is going these days and the connection to the field of historic preservation or just historic architecture generally?
Yeah, really interesting question. Very, very germane to our current times. So one of the interesting things, if you look at accepted professional historic preservation practice, in the regulatory environment, one of the things that is very heavily emphasized and also interpreted, it's number 9, the Secretary of the Interior standards. And the standards discusses the need to, quote unquote, differentiate the old from the new. This goes all the way back to, there's an Italian architect by the name of Camillo Boito that talked endlessly about this. But the interesting thing is that it was really developed really strongly in the modernist era in the US and abroad. So that need to differentiate became a mantra that modernist architects were espousing, because there's a lot of modernist architects. It's really fascinating. They loved older buildings. They really were preservationists. James Marston Fish, he created Columbia's historic preservation program, was a modernist. He was a modernist architect. He really loved modernism, but he also loved historic preservation. And he's a great example in his writings. He's very clear in saying we need to preserve these old buildings, but we can never, ever create a new building in historical design because it would be unethical. And that's the modernist perspective. There's a book by Stephen Semmes. It's called The Future of the Past, where he goes into all this modernist history and how historic preservation doctrine and policy developed in the US, which reified this idea that you have to differentiate the old from the new because you cannot historically replicate the past design today. And so that thread is a little less strong today, but it's still a very prominent idea. So you'll have preservationists, if they're operating in this mode the way they should be, I'll put that in quotes, looking at, say, the addition to the White House. And I mean, there's obvious things about scale and massing that you don't need to have come from a preservation background to say, no, I don't know if that's appropriate. But if you're looking at just the design, preservationists are much more likely to say the issue with the design is that it is classical and that it looks like a manufactured relic, that it's trying to accurately replicate, the columns, and I guess they got rid of the pediment, but that it's meant to look like something that was built in 1800. That is not what you're supposed to be doing according to orthodoxy in historic preservation. So the weird way to put this, if I can put this as succinctly as possible, is that according to preservation doctrine and policy, preservationists are supposed to hate historical design while also loving it. So we save it when it's already here, but we hate it when we want to replicate it in a new design. And then theoretically, the reason why is because it would confuse the public. They wouldn't know, like, if that addition to the White House was actually newly constructed or it's 250 years old, right? And to me, that's an empirical psychological question we don't have a good answer to, right? If we're actually doing this work to differentiate the old from the new, shouldn't we know how that should work? We don't have any empirical basis for that. And all of that was developed by a group of Italian Gestalt psychologists, that's sort of a rationalistic version of psychology, who armchair theorized the idea of differentiating the old from the new. So we don't have any good actually empirical evidence for what we're actually doing. So I would say, though, kind of bringing it back to what the original kind of framing of this about, say, especially like neoclassical architecture and how it can be embraced by white supremacists, that's absolutely much more of a factor in terms of, in essence, violating preservation orthodoxy to the future. But absolutely, it is a very strong impetus to save older buildings that embody that style. And that's where I think in talking about the preservation world, where that's an issue, because it's much easier to present a case to save, or to say, you want to list a building on the local register in your town because you want design review protections for it. So it can't be demolished, can't be changed. You can save it the way it looks today. It's much easier to do that with a high style building, because high style buildings are much less likely to change over time than, say, a very ordinary vernacular place that doesn't have those high style features, but has changed a lot more over time. And more people in that community may really love that older vernacular place much more than, this neoclassical mansion. But the neoclassical mansion will succeed because it's easier to preserve it under our policy orthodoxy and preservation.
What's been the positive reaction to your book?
So there's a group of people that I guess we're calling ourselves people-centered preservationists, that we're supporting our work. And a lot of those people that I know are out of Europe, like the United Kingdom. So there's some researchers and some practitioners out there, like working for English Heritage, that we've all written on this and we're supporting each other's work. There's some people out of Australia. And so we always recognize what we think is good work, that serving the public and what we're doing. And I think the difference in my situation is, in Europe, it's much more likely for there to be policy change around how the older built environment is conserved than here in the US. There's also a lot more research funding that these people are able to apply. So like when you have someone like me or Erica Avrami or even Sarah Bronin, she's an academic and she's published academic research on this. It's hard to find research funding on this in the US. And it's just harder to find support for what it is that you're trying to do. It's much more likely, well, like in the case I did this presentation, obviously the person who invited me to do the keynote was supportive of my work and thought it should be brought to a broader audience. But there were many people in the audience that did not like the message that I was sending. I mean, in addition to being told that my work was very controversial, there's one gentleman that walked up to me and he said, if I can remember this correctly, boy, your work is the embodiment of anarchy. And it's like, that's interesting. So it's not like if I magically could transport myself to England, everybody would love my work. But I'm saying there's just a much stronger, it's harder to find supporters in the US for this kind of thing than elsewhere, is the best way to put it. But not that this is universally supported by any means, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I guess my greatest supporters are generally, especially in the US, are coming from planning and environmental psychology and to some extent landscape architecture, because those are fields that are more open to the social sciences and this people-centered perspective. And I think actually in terms of the research that's being done, as well as practice changes, it's people from planning, especially, that are making these changes. And they're working outside the regulatory environment. I'm thinking of people like Andrea Roberts. She's done some excellent work centered on Texas freedom colonies and looking at the difficulties of preserving African-American heritage within the regulatory environment. And what she's finding in so many people in the situation is that you don't have to actually work in the policy environment. There are lots of tools outside of that. And that's where I actually see the promise in terms of historic preservation, is like, I think there always has to be some sort of regulatory center to it, but does it have to be nearly 3/4 of the field? Probably not. But the challenge is, especially for people who are trying to find an educational path in preservation and finding jobs working in it, these pathways don't exist. You can be this rarefied entity like I was in the university researcher, Whether you can actually influence much from that, I don't know. There's not a lot of doors to go through where, kind of back to your original question, where people want this kind of work done.
Yeah. Well, the book is Managing the Magic of Old Places, Crafting Public Policies for People-Centered Historic Preservation. Where can folks find a copy?
Oh, gosh. I mean, lots of different places. So it's University of Tennessee Press. You can get it through Amazon. Your local bookstore should easily be able to order a copy. So it's easy to find.
Awesome. And where can folks find you if you wish to be found?
I'm in the DC area. If anybody wants to get a hold of me, please do. My email address is dr.jeremy, Jeremy, .wells, WELLS, @gmail.com.
Awesome. Well, Jeremy, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Jeff, I love the conversation and, always love to talk to people in the planning world. And I love your insight and your curiosity. It's great.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of the Overhead Wire and appears first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters who support this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. You can support the show as always by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Sign up for our almost 20-year-old newsletter as well by visiting theoverheadwire.com or check out the show notes for merch or other opportunities to connect. Follow along using your podcatcher of choice, but if you can't find it there, you can always find it at its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways. Hey everybody, we're past the main credits. Here we are at the end of the show. But I do want to give a shout out to some of our $10 a month or more Patreon supporters who've been helping the show along with your very, very generous support. If you've made it this far, you're probably a really big listener and reader. We really appreciate that. When I get new supporters, I'll update this section, so I hope that happens often. First names only, but big thanks to Andrew, Ben, Derek, Gabrielle, Glenn, Greg, James, Jeremy, Jim, Joseph, Catherine, Mao, Marcus, Matthew, Mike, Nicholas, Abraham, Oliver, Steve, Abby, Ed, Matthew, and recently added Sylvia. Everybody who listens to this show and reads the newsletter is much, much appreciated. I just wanted to give our biggest supporters a little extra love and recognition. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you next time.